Welcome to the Rob Call Bottom Up Show, available on Progressive Radio Network, Pacifica Radio, iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, at the opednews.com/podcast page where the complete archives of the show are kept, and more. I'm really pleased to have as my guest for this show Joel Edward Goza. He's a minister, activist in predominantly Black and Latino Houston's Fifth Ward, and is the author of America's Unholy Ghosts, The Racist Roots of Our Faith and Politics. His website is joeledwardgoza.com. Great to have you on the show.
Such an honor to be with you this afternoon. Thankful for the opportunity to get to talk with you, Rob.
Yeah, well, you've got an important message, the racist roots of our faith and politics.
Yes, sir.
What are the goals for this book?
Well, really, I wrote the book coming off of several years of really a critical self-examination of my own worldview. And, part of my story is that I moved into Houston's Fifth Ward community, which is a predominantly African-American Latino community. And yet I was raised in white suburbia. And once I moved in, I kind of came in with kind of a hybrid of a conservative Christian free market ideology worldview. And once I came into the neighborhood, that worldview could no longer make sense of the world that I was experiencing. And so I entered into this crisis moment of really trying to rethink my world from the bottom up. And one of the things that I began realizing as I was examining my world is that what I was witnessing in the inner city, the way that I thought about our world and its problems was a way of thinking that actually made the problems worse.
Wow.
And so what I try to do in the book is really trying to take the crisis that I went through personally and show a very deep examination of the American worldview. And I became convinced that what is cultural common sense today in America was a cultural common sense that was originally designed to harmonize the institutions of American democracy and Christianity with the institution of slavery.
Tell me more about that.
Yeah, absolutely. What I examine in the book are some of the lies that we ended up having to tell ourselves in order to make our politics harmonize with the institution of slavery. And I examined three that are critical. The first lie that we told ourselves in the American experiment was that politics is not about the common good. The American experiment is emerging from the Enlightenment that was really crafted to respond to the wars of religion in Europe. And one of the things that ends up happening is rather than rooting politics in the common good, we had to root politics in the preservation of property. And so when the American Revolution is going on, we're talking about taxation without representation, for instance. And this is tyranny because it's an attack on property. Well, of course, what's ironic is that the slavery that defined America, that wasn't the problem. What the problem was taxes. And it was a worldview that basically good politics is only preserving taxes or preserving property. The second myth that I examine in depth is the view that economics can be considered a moral free math. That economics is just grids and graphs. And so no longer does economic concepts such as a just wage or people being made in God's image or equity or fairness enter into economic calculations. Economics is considered a moral free math. And then once you have a government and an economic system that has no interest in providing for poor people, what does the justice system do? Well, what the justice system ends up doing in American history is providing a very punitive enforcement of the status quo. And so justice becomes retributive rather than restorative. And I work on the religious side of the scale too, but basically what I examine is how the very ways that we think about government, the very ways that we think about economics, the very ways we think about justice has created the type of racial crisis that we find ourselves in today.
And what was the third lie?
The third lie was that justice is retributive rather than restorative. And so if you think about the child fable, little bunny foo-foo hopping through the forest. Well, what does the good fairy come down and do? She says that she'll give her 3 strikes and then she's going to turn the rule breaker into a goon. And that's basically becomes what the American justice system is about, is it's only about punishing people. It's not about restoring people, and it's not about questioning how we can be a society that better takes care of one another, and in particular takes care of the poor and the vulnerable.
What's great is that restorative justice is really becoming alive in America today. There's more and more of it happening. I'm in the Philadelphia area. The relatively newly elected DA, Larry Krasner, has embraced restorative justice, and we're seeing more of it around the country. I've done interviews about restorative justice, and it's so important.
Yeah, it's hugely important. And, you have people doing wonderful, wonderful work really on that forefront, people like a Michelle Alexander. When you look at, some of the Supreme Court justices we've had, Judge Anthony Scalia, one of the things that he writes very explicitly before he's a Supreme Court justice is that in American history, there isn't place for a restorative justice. He thinks restorative justice is racist and that there doesn't need to be. And historically, Anthony Scalia is pretty accurate that when our founders established the nation, they didn't see the need for a type of restorative justice system, but that was precisely the problem. And it's addressing issues like that becomes very urgent in the times that we're in.
Now, those are the political lies. You also refer to religious lies.
Right. And one of the things that becomes intentional within the American experiment and the enlightenment that it's born out of is that we have to retrain Christians to think about Christianity in a very new way in order to get comfortable with what ends up happening. And the 3 lies that I examine in the book, the first lie is that people can be in the right relationship with the God of the Bible without being in right relationship with the broken and the abused. And so what matters in the age of reason, quote unquote, isn't relationship. Religions get reduced to formulas. The second lie is that the critical part of that formula is that religion is about soul salvation. No longer is religion about what the prophetic tradition heralds of caring for the widow and the orphan and the poor and the immigrant. Religion is just reduced to saving people's souls. Then the final lie is that indifference to injustice is no threat to one's intimacy with God. And once we get Christians thinking along these lines, what ends up happening is that they become cogs in a wheel that does incredibly destructive racial and economic work throughout society. And what the Enlightenment philosophers understood is that to get political traction, they had to convince Christians that what they were trying to do was a good idea and in harmony with their religious convictions. Ended up falling there. Okay. So we're back on our feet.
No problem. So now your answer is the prophetic Black church.
Right. So one of the things that ends up happening to me is that I am taken in by an African American church here in the community. I end up working there for about 10 years, and they really made the works of people like a Martin Luther King Jr. come alive. And one of the things
you said you worked there for 10 years. What did you do?
Yeah, so it was a church that really spearheaded the community's urban redevelopment, and so we worked on community issues, everything from education to health to housing to immigration. We spearheaded a lot of that work that was happening here in Houston. And then you also just had your normal church functions, so in the day you might be meeting with someone from political office. In the evenings, you're in the public apartments. And so it really was a position that spanned the entire community's life. and provided, you know, an intimacy with the community that's pretty hard to imagine outside of a unique opportunity like that.
What was your job title there?
Well, my job title was the assistant to the pastor. And so the stuff that he was involved with is the stuff that I've worked with, and he was involved with a whole lot. You know, specifically what my niche ended up being for a lot of the work was really fostering institutional partnerships to try to work for the type of systemic changes that we were bringing about.
But what I don't get is, you know, how did a white guy like you get into a black, you know, that kind of a church?
Yeah, well, you know, I said that there was a series of holy accidents that took place, but basically what ended up happening is that, you know, I wanted to find an inner city church, but since I didn't speak Spanish, I wanted to find one that spoke English. And it was really my desire to be in an inner city church that spoke English. Well, I mean, my faith was very important to me. And when I went to white churches and I was living in the inner city, it was like we were living in two different worlds, you know, and so we might only be 3 miles away from each other, but the worlds that we inhabited on a daily basis were completely different from the world that I was witnessing every day in the inner city. And so that became a very unworkable thing for where I went to worship.
How were they different? You said they were so completely different.
Yeah, so like when I went into the African American church, as I describe it in the book, it was almost like putting on a pair of glasses when you didn't realize your vision was skewed. And what was obvious to me when I first entered into the African American church is that it was born out of deep intimacy with the broken and the abused, and that the very worship experience itself was an attempt to restore human dignity. And the sermons had, you know, that type of prophetic bent, to where when I was in many of the white churches that I had worshiped at, there was absolutely no intimacy between their worship experience and the lived realities of the community that I was facing on a daily basis.
I think, you know, I'm Jewish, and I left the synagogue because I found that was the case. They would read prayers that somebody had written 40 years ago or something.
Sure.
Yeah. So, wow.
Yeah.
So you up and left. You had been working at a white church.
Well, I was actually at KPMG, which is a financial firm at that time. And what ended up happening is that I ended up going back to school in the midst, after I had moved into the community. I stayed for a year, and then I went back and I finished up seminary. And it was actually in searching for a church internship that I got connected with the church that I ended up working at for 10 years. And so I had felt that I was going to really probably stay in the business community, but I had gone back to seminary so that I could be a resource to whatever church that I ended up being a part of. And it just so happened, even though I set up a relationship with them, really just looking for a church home, that when we worked together, it seemed to make sense to give it a try. So after I graduated from Duke University, from their seminary there, I ended up going working full-time in 2007 is when I started working full-time, and worked through 2016.
So tell me about the Prophetic Black Church. What does that mean? How is it different? What's involved?
Yeah, so when you look at the Prophetic Black Church, what I'm particularly talking about is the tradition that formed people like a Martin Luther King Jr. and that followed in King's footsteps. So when you are in a prophetic black church, one of the things that ends up happening is that what religion is judged by and what politics are judged by are their impact on the poor. And so it becomes a place that is about the restoration of human dignity, that it is about the struggle for the poor and the marginalized. And that really provides a vision to our nation that politics can be fundamentally different than what it is on a daily basis. And probably the best example of that is really when King and Lyndon B. Johnson are working together. And we don't talk about it very often, but it's really the sacrifices of the civil rights movement that paves the way for the war on poverty and for very practical legislation like Medicaid and Medicare, investments in education, caring for the environment. The prophetic Black church and the sacrifices that it made created an environment that during at least one congressional session really reshaped America's life.
I need to understand what is prophetic Black church? What's the prophetic in prophetic Black church? What does that mean?
So what the prophetic tradition does within Scripture particularly is that it looks at the world and at politics through the lens of what's happening on with the poor and the oppressed. And so whether you're pulling from Hebrew scriptures with Jeremiah and Isaiah, or whether you're pulling from perhaps the Gospels, like the Gospel of Matthew 25, when Jesus says that when you've done it unto the least of these, you've done it unto me. That becomes the anchor point for the prophetic Black church. To contrast that with the church that I grew up in is that I knew before I had read the Bible that religion was about soul salvation. That's what I was trained to think and how I was trained to lean into my understanding of religion. And under that equation, what ended up becoming the most important verses were in the scripture were verses like John 3:16, which says that God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten son, that who would ever so believe in him shall not perish but have everlasting life. And what ends up happening in white Christianity and Christianity that doesn't have the prophetic bent is that it examines scripture and the religious life without any connection to the earthly life and for God's desire for justice.
Okay, so, this is the bottom-up show.
Mm-hmm.
I think what you just described is that the prophetic church looks at a bottom-up approach to the people in the world.
Absolutely.
And the other approach, the one about soul salvation, is like, hey, I'm going to get my ass covered so that I can go to heaven and get approved by the powers that be.
Absolutely. And it is able to harmonize with grotesque inequalities. And, one of the things that, one of the differences that you see between the Black church and the white church, particularly since the civil rights movements, is when you look at religion in America, the two religions that have the most in common are white evangelical Christianity and Black Protestantism. And yet when you see the religions that vote in the most opposite direction, it is Black Protestantism and white Christianity. And that divide only grew and is growing precisely because it reads Christianity completely different than what white Christianity reads it through. It doesn't, Black Christianity doesn't travel through the lens of white supremacy in the way that white Christianity does.
Well, Donald Trump's main base is white Christianity, evangelicals.
Absolutely. And that has a very long history.
Christian Zionists who are waiting for the rapture, who love what's happening in Israel because the Satan's going to come back and will be raptured off to heaven.
Right. And when you go back in history, who was one of the most inspirational leaders from the Klan? It was a preacher named Thomas Dixon who writes The Klansman and inspires the Birth of the Nation movement. And what white Christians have always been able to do is to harmonize their politics with very racist instincts, to where racism is not a deal breaker for white Christians in the way that it is for African American Christians. And particularly when I talk with white Christian audiences, one of the challenges is that so many white Christians think in one-dimensional ways in a three-dimensional world. And when Black Christians, because of the suffering and the history that they don't have the ability to think that way. I mean, they see, for instance, one of the things that white conservative Christians were convinced of was that they could vote for Trump and they could get a godly judge in office. and they don't have no idea of the bearing of race and conservative justice on the Supreme Court. And when Trump ends up electing somebody or nominating Neil Gorsuch for the Supreme Court, it is not surprising that one of Gorsuch's first opinions ends up supporting capital punishment for an African-American inmate in a very questionable verdict that ends up being held up by Supreme Court justices. But tragically, white Christians seem content to be oblivious to the type of racial work that their Supreme Court justices often end up supporting.
Now, there are about 1.3 million Christians, or is it Catholics?
Millions more on both. Yeah. So like our archdiocese in Houston is probably close to 2 million.
I meant billion. 1.3.
Oh, billion. Yeah. Billion. Yeah.
So most of them are white, aren't they?
No. In America, there's a lot of white Christians, but worldwide, white Christians are certainly the minority.
And what about these prophetic Christians? How many of them are there?
Yeah, so I mean, a lot that followed King from the African American tradition, they're still there, But one of the things that ends up happening is, even though you have this conservative Christianity on the white side, you also have white liberalism, and yet one of the things that ends up happening is that white liberals have not learned very much from Martin Luther King Jr. either. And
when I'm in your book that white liberals made racial issues worse.
Yes, absolutely. One of the things that white conservative Christians and white liberal Christians always had in common was they didn't have to learn from Black people. And so when you look historically on what has happened, particularly over the last 30 years, one of the greatest tragedies was following the Greatest Generation. And the Greatest Generation really crafted programs that was able to address racial and economic issues. And yet when the politicians of the Boomer generation came along, whether a liberal or a conservative, both liberals and conservatives ended up following the most racist of the Greatest Generation. Reagan becomes very transformative. But when you look at issues of race and equity, Mitch McConnell, Hillary Clinton, Joe Biden, they have a lot more in common with each other's vision than they do with the visions from Martin Luther King Jr. And the type of racial inequality that we're dealing with today, does it have a legacy in slavery? Well, absolutely. But was it formed by the political policies of the last 30 to 40 years and exacerbated by that? It most definitely was.
And it goes way back before that. And I want to take a break, and then we're going to get into the role of people from way back. So.
All right, that sounds great.
My guest for the show is Joel Edward Goza. He's a minister, an activist in predominantly Black and Latino Houston's Fifth Ward, and he's the author of America's Unholy Ghosts, the Racist Roots of Our Faith and Politics. Now, you dedicate a lot of your book to dealing with Thomas Hobbes, John Locke, and Adam Smith. Mm-hmm. And you say their works collectively imagined, institutionalized, and ingrained racist ideologies into the hearts and minds of the American people.
Absolutely. Yes, sir. Yes, sir. These were the guys that our founders were reading, and that was really forming their thoughts on how do we create the American experiment. And so, one of the guys that I write about is John Locke, who's the father of liberalism, who proved hugely transformational for Thomas Jefferson. In fact, a lot of the rhetoric from the Revolution is taken directly from the works of John Locke. But one of the things that becomes really troubling is when you think about equality, a lot of that type of thinking is inspired by John Locke. And so when Thomas Jefferson writes that all people are created equal, he has Locke in mind. And the issue is is that he writes all people are created equal, but he's not convinced that African Americans are even human. He thinks that African Americans might be somehow related to apes. And one of the things that was really popular during the times that Thomas Jefferson is writing is a myth that John Locke put forward, where he starts talking about these women in Africa and they're having sex with baboons. And what Locke says is, what are we to call these new creatures? He goes, we really don't know. That becomes a very new question for us. And those type of writings, Jefferson basically plagiarizes. And so when he says all people are created equal, he's questioning whether or not African Americans are humans at all.
Wow.
It's quite frightening. It's quite frightening, but he's not being hypocritical or he's not being inconsistent. He's a very consistent thinker in all of his writings, but he has a very sick racist imagination that ends up giving birth to the American experiment. Well,
that was the narrative at the time.
Mm-hmm. It most definitely was. It most definitely was. And in many ways, white supremacy becomes the spectacles through which all of our forefathers are looking out into the world, and it becomes formative. And one of the things that happens is that whenever you have racist public policies in America, you have these mythologies that are going on in the background that justified the racist public policies and made it seem that those racist public policies were necessary for our nation's survival. And we're still living with these racist mythologies, and they're still fundamentally at war with our nation.
Now, what about Hobbes? How did he contribute to this?
Well, one of the things Hobbes tried to do is he was really concerned about religion, and he was convinced that we couldn't save ourselves through religious zealotry. So he's born in the wars of religion, and what Hobbes writes is he's like, man, when I was born, my mother gave birth to twins, to myself and to fear. And what Hobbes wants to do is he wants to create a more rational world. And so what he wants to do is convince people to lean more into their reasonable natures rather than their religious. But the problem ends up happening with Hobbes is that when he talks about reason, two things end up happening. One is that reason has to be individualized, and two, it has to be self-interested. And so when rich white men in Europe individualized reason and made it self-interested, what looked reasonable? It was rich white men. What looked unreasonable? Well, those were savages. Those were the Indians of America. Those were the slaves of Africa. And since they were savages, we could declare war on them and that be fine. And one of the interesting things that ends up happening in Locke's work is that he creates this myth of scarcity, where the world's resources are not enough for the world. But what ends up happening in his philosophies is that rather than the world's scarcity demanding equity, what scarcity demands is accumulation. And so he designs a colonial experiment to where England can accumulate the world's resources and use the bodies of savages to do whatever work they can in order to make the wealthy folk a little more wealthy and a little more secure in their world. And that becomes a very devastating impact to the works of Hobbes. And he makes sure that economics is always considered a moral free math.
Fascinating, because I've had a lot of conversations about Hobbes, because Hobbes put out this idea of the savage and the rule of the jungle and the violent nature of the savage world. Right. And I guess that's part of his justification. And what I hadn't heard was this other part, that it was the myth of scarcity, and that it was okay to steal from the savage and exploit the savage.
Yes, and it's very explicit in his work. And, he really becomes, and he has no fear of economic inequality. But he becomes very influential on Hamilton, and how Hamilton ends up designing Wall Street through what's called contract theory. And basically what the notion of contract theory is that all that justice demands are contracts. And if those contracts end up persecuting some people, so be it. But as long as the contract is there, that's all that justice demands. And it becomes very important in the first Congress, and it comes to life when we're looking at how we repay our veterans. And basically what ends up happening is that rather than paying veterans for their service, there were schemes in place that Wall Street made all the profits off of our veteran service rather than poor veterans. And Hamilton, who was very familiar with Hobbes, is the one that really pushes through that legislation that creates the type of racial economic inequalities that we still wrestle with today.
And then there's Adam Smith.
Right. And, you know, it's interesting because Adam Smith is the only one who is adamantly opposed to slavery. And, you know, when Adam Smith is writing, he'll say, you know, what is slavery? Well, he says, you know, a lot of it comes from white people wanting to rape African-American women. That's where slavery comes from. Why do we still have the slave trade? It's because, and what Smith will write is because we kill off so many of their children so quickly. And yet, even though he sees all these inequalities, one of the things that Smith is convinced of is that if we can just stay the course, that things will correct themselves. And so he becomes the father of the free market and allowing, quote unquote, the invisible hand to determine society's future. And what Adam Smith had wanted was an equitable society. But what ends up happening is that we took a lot of the worst that Adam Smith had to offer, and it became very formative for our entire way of life. And it really is a tragedy. But he was very influenced by the Stoic tradition. And what I write about ends up happening is that when we think about morality and economics, most Christians end up following Adam Smith. And so even though the churches are Christian in name, they become Stoic in nature, and they become these passive observers of the injustices that are going on in society.
Fascinating. So, boy, I'm just taking some notes here.
Yeah. So, and maybe a great way to think of Adam Smith is through Martin Luther King Jr.'s letter from a Birmingham prison.
How's that?
Well, in many ways, Adam Smith and Martin Luther King Jr. analyze the world's problems very similarly, but the solutions are very opposite. So, in a letter from Birmingham jail, he really has two national targets in his mind. He's talking to local clergy, but on the political scene, he's addressing the liberal president, John F. Kennedy. On the religious scene, he's addressing the conservative preacher, Billy Graham. And what he basically critiques is that they stand on the sidelines and really do nothing. And that justice never comes naturally. It only comes when we fight for it and when we really engage in the struggle. And so even though Adam Smith and MLK have very similar insights into our society, they have very different ways of addressing it, to where MLK called forth a more self-sacrificial direct addressing, and Adam Smith in many ways encouraged the moderate spectators that just stood on the sidelines.
Wow. I'm still not clear why he had that attitude, like that things would work out.
Yeah, there becomes this tension in his thoughts. But basically, one of the things that the Stoics believed is that, you know, Stoicism itself was formed to help rich people sleep with themselves in a very inequitable societies. You know, I mean, it comes from the merchant Zeno. And what Adam Smith hoped is that what he was seeing taking place with the Dutch would take place across the world. And so what he really believed is that in the age where the machine and the man can partner, if we can encourage that partnership, we will create wealth that will be defined by the poorest people among us. And what he's seeing happen among the Dutch is that the people who are making pens make a lot of money, and they have plenty to survive. And he really believes that the Dutch world order can become the entire world order. And he judges a healthy economy by what is happening to the poorest people in society. And he thinks if we can just stay the course in this modern experiment, and if America would really listen to what he was writing about, that perhaps America can take the Dutch form of things and put it throughout the entire world, which is really a fascinating possibility. So he releases Wealth of Nations in 1776 with the hopes that by pursuing a just capitalism, we can eradicate poverty throughout the world. And I mean, he will say plainly that, you know, you judge the economy by what the poorest people make, that the healthy economy has corporations with very low profits, and that they don't allow their corporate leaders into their politics or to interfere with their politics. And so it ended up taking a very different course. But what he didn't, what the Stoics believe is that when you look at the world order, it's a reflection of God's world order. And that if you mess with it intentionally too much, that you're going to have unintended consequences that will create greater injustices down the road.
About maintaining the status quo. That's it.
Right. And that's what it is, which is very opposite of what the prophetic tradition calls for, to where what you see in the world is not the God-ordained way of things. It's what happens when people no longer respect the image of God in one another.
And I mean, even in recent times, the modern Christians have cited, you know, part of being a good Christian is being obedient to authority.
Right. Obedience to rule. So what Thomas Hobbes says is that what does it mean to be a Christian? It means 1, faith in Jesus, and 2, obedience to rulers. That's all Christianity means for Thomas Hobbes.
You know, I've always been disgusted by him. I think he was a vile, evil person who foisted upon the world these ideas that have existed. I mean, they're still in existence. A lot of people still believe in a Hobbesian view of the world. And it's disgusting. It's sick.
It is worse.
Maybe it's psychopathic. I don't know.
Well, I mean, it is very much psychopathic in many ways, but this becomes the difference between the Hobbesian world order and the American world order, is that Hobbes was not sentimental at all. John Locke, the father of liberalism, he was sentimental, and what he always tried to do is to put a pretty face on very evil work. And so, I mean, this is where you get, you know, slavery being for the benefit of the slaves type thinking. And in the face of injustice, sentimentalism becomes the worst response possible, but sentimentalism becomes so ingrained within white supremacy that it becomes a very Hobbesian world order, but we don't even recognize the type of evil that we participate in. Because because we become so sentimental in the way that we think about things.
What do you mean by sentimental? I'm not clear. How is sentimentalism tied to white supremacy? What is sentimentalism?
Well, take a Jefferson, for instance. You know, take Jefferson. Jefferson really wanted slavery to end, but after his lifetime. You know, and so he kind of poses as this big-hearted person, but he never makes the sacrifices that justice requires. When you look at liberalism writ large, you know, over the last 30 to 40 years, it wasn't that liberals always were really in solidarity with the broken and the oppressed. They were often very segregated from them. And so I think if you said, what does sentimentalism look like? You know, I think what King would say is it looks like the white moderates and it looks like the white liberals who aren't here in the streets with us, who say that they're our friends, but don't really provide the type of revolution that we need in very practical ways.
Put it in modern terms, not.
Well, I think so. Talk about reparations, for instance. You know, when we talk about reparations, what reparations are really trying to do is to provide a realistic way to address the type of radical racial inequalities that we're dealing with that were born in slavery. And yet, when you look at the Democrats through the last 20 to 30 years, they really weren't very open to the work of John Conyers when he was calling for reparations. And the belief is that if you have a strong economy, everything's just going to kind of take care of itself, and that was never the case.
Conyers was the man who put through, after a lot of fighting, Martin Luther King Day.
Right, he was, and for 30 years he spearheaded every year the fight for reparations. And he comes up during the War of Poverty, is when his congressional career starts. And yet, when he was fighting for reparations, beginning in I believe it's 1988, when he starts bringing it before the House of Congress on a yearly basis, it's not like the white liberals were standing there supporting him in that fight. And I think a lot of that is because the way that we've dealt with racial justice and economic justice has been more sentimental than it has been realistic in the way that we approach our public policies.
Yeah. You talk about how white supremacy evolved, but the architecture never changed, and the church is run with the architecture of white supremacy.
Mm-hmm. Right. And so one of the things that I write about is, what I felt like I witnessed in the inner city communities was destruction by design. And so white supremacy ends up evolving. Before the times of slavery, white supremacy took the institutional form of slavery. After slavery, after the Emancipation Proclamation and the Civil War, white supremacy took the form of Jim Crow laws in the South, different types of laws that were dividing housing and things in the North. But we really, under Jim Crow, we truly believed that we could not survive as an integrated nation. And Chicago and New York end up becoming, basically as segregated as the South during these times. Once segregation is wiped off the table, we have the colorblind age. But in many ways, American society continues to stay every bit as segregated. Economic inequalities end up going up, and you have works such as, the bell curve, for instance, that said that basically what the problem is that Black folks aren't quite intelligent enough, and that's why we have the type of divides that we end up having. And so when you look at what is the work that is taking place through public policy on African American communities and African American people, that white supremacy has evolved, but the basic architecture of it has stayed the same.
How does that affect the average person today?
Well, I mean, if you look at the average white family, they have 11 times more wealth than the average African American family. And what was easy for me to think before I moved into inner city community is that, the problem of poor people is the poor people. It's not the racist public policies that are really forming them. And what ends up happening is we create a world. One of in A Brave New World, the author has the term of social predestination. And that's what ends up happening throughout America, is that, where you're born is the number one indicator of where you'll end up, rather than your own work or your own effort. And we've created a mythology that is different than that. But, as sociologists across the nation will tell you that, demographics determine destiny too often in America.
All right, we need to take another break, and then you're going to talk about how Fox News became more influential with white Christians than Jesus himself.
All right, that sounds like a plan.
My guest for the show is Joel Edward Goza. He's a minister, activist in predominantly African American and Latino Houston's Fifth Ward, and he's the author of America's Unholy Ghosts, The Racist Roots of Our Faith and Politics. How has Fox become more influential with white Christians than Jesus himself?
Yeah, that's a great question. I actually write about that during the chapter on Thomas Hobbes. And one of the brilliant things with Thomas Hobbes is that he wants to create a rational world order. And yet so he talks about education and how do you train people to be obedient. He talks about a lot of different things. But at the end of the day, when everything else fails, one of the things that Hobbes makes very clear to leaders is that they have to keep people being perpetually fearful. And what he wants to do with fear is to keep their fears very vague, so that at the politically right time, that a ruler can name the fear and get people to do his bidding. So what ends up happening within the American context is that, in 88, you have the fall of the Fairness Doctrine. And what the Fairness Doctrine was, for people who are not familiar with it, is before 1988, if you're on radio, if you're on TV, you had to be somewhat bipartisan. You had to show two sides of the same story from different political perspectives. What happens is that that ends up falling, and it brings to power a man named Roger Ailes. And Ailes had already had a long history at this point in American politics. He helps Richard Nixon to get elected. He helps Ronald Reagan to get elected. He'll end up helping Bush during his first term to get reelected. But what Roger Ailes ends up becoming incredibly persuasive and has an unbelievable ability to do is to manipulate the fears of white conservatives. And by manipulating their fears, whether it's of immigration, this, that, or the other, of liberalism, they become a puppet and become more reflective of his hates and his fears than the love of Jesus that they claim to serve and to follow. One of the things that is absolutely amazing is that any Christian worldview, if you looked for Jesus in America today, it would be the kids who are in cages at the border. Jesus said that when you looked at immigrants, you were looking at me, because he himself had to immigrate. And yet Christians find themselves ready to support Donald Trump because they have received decade upon decade of indoctrination into a fear-based politics that has really haunted the American experiment from its inception, but finds poignant expression today in the opinions of media outlets such as Fox News.
Your final chapter is that it's really hard.
Yeah.
Hard, rewriting the rules. And you start off by talking about a story about JFK and the space program.
Right. And so, I write from Houston, and, JFK came to Rice University, and he gives this great speech that was helped. Ted Sorensen helped write it, but basically he says, we choose to go to the moon and do the other things, not because it is easy, but because it is hard. And yet what's interesting when you look at Kennedy is that Kennedy truly believed that we could defeat gravity, that we could place a man on the moon, that we could build spaceships, even at a time when we didn't have any of this stuff in place. And he believed we could do that. And yet Kennedy did not believe that we could defeat segregation. He did not fight for equality very often in very meaningful ways. There was some legislation he did. But what I write in the last chapter is that the reason that we have the type of inequalities that we do today is because the rules of the game, the very laws that we have written, the public policies that we have produced have created these inequalities. And the only way to change that is to rewrite the laws so that we intentionally pursue equity. And one of the things that becomes very interesting historically is that the same person that writes the "We Choose to Go to the Moon" speech is Ted Sorensen, who writes LBJ's War on Poverty speech. And the formulas end up becoming remarkably similar. And so what JFK said is, we don't know how we're going to get to the moon, but we're going to change the budgets. We're going to learn as we go. And the last destination for our space trip isn't all the failures along the way, but it's putting a man on the moon, which is the exact formula that Sorensen used on the War of Poverty. We don't know how to defeat poverty right now, but we're going to rewrite this federal budget in order to do it. And we're going to continue on the War of Poverty until poverty is eradicated and that equality becomes real and not just theoretical in America.
I like the way you say that racism is not rocket science, it's harder.
Right. Yeah, that's actually a quote by a rocket scientist. And it is so, white supremacy and racial thinking. One of the things I write about in the book is that, it's not just an individualistic problem. It's much more like a sickness from air pollution, where it is part of the air we breathe. And it's not just a matter of running harder to get healthier. It's about the real work of changing America's ecosystem, so that we can see that the type of injustices that we have in America are American made, not God ordained. And since they're American made, they can be American unmade.
So we've got about 7 minutes left. How do we fix things? How do we make things better?
Yeah, well, that is perhaps not the book's strength. I don't know if I prescribe one way of doing it, but one of the things that becomes clear to me when you look at these things, and this might be the next book, is that the truth of the matter is that America has always had answers to her racial problems, from the days of slavery through segregation through the colorblind age. It's just that the people who had the answers were the ones that we ignored, because they were African Americans. And what the African American activist tradition has told America throughout its history, its story, it's never changed, is that America will never be the place of liberty and justice until we intentionally work for equality across the color line. And so we have to begin looking now at the works of reparations. We have to begin listening to people that we've long ignored. And we have to begin realizing that the type of radical changes that we need are changes that we can participate in. In the book, the book basically comes to an end saying, basically, one of the things I'm hoping to do is to show that we are not just spectators in this struggle, we are participants. And radical change ends up happening. And in American history, there has been radical changes that have taken place in 2 to 3 year increments. Whether you look at radical Reconstruction, whether you look at the New Deal, whether you look at the civil rights legislation, is that radical change is possible. And it is not a matter in the era of Trump of restoring an unhealthy status quo.
It makes me think of Howard Zinn's book, The People's History of the United States. And I've written in my book, Bottom Up Revolution, which you can find at robcall.com, about how bottom-up history started being taught about 40 years ago.
Right.
The difference between top-down history, where it's all about the most powerful people, the kings and the corporate titans and the generals, and bottom-up history, which is about average people, workers and soldiers and farmers and people of color, is that when you teach bottom-up history, then people start seeing the possibilities that the average person can make changes happen. And we have to have that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I write a lot about history, and even the way that we talk about history has to change. And one of the things that I write about is how, for Hobbes, history was important, but what was important is that you didn't talk about the sins of your nation. What Hobbes was very clear about is that you want to tell history in a way that makes us loyal rather than question things. And it is time for us to learn American history by its impact on African Americans and poor folks.
I think, and the other thing we need to learn is that we have to ask questions. We have to challenge everything, question everything. Because, even looking at our politics today, everything is spun. Everything has an angle and is told with an intention. And so you have to look at everything.
And look at everything, question everything, but I think that we also must own everything. And what I mean by that is that the problems are not outside of us. The solution isn't going to come from outside of us and the problems from outside of us. It is that these are some of the realities that we helped craft. And we've got to own our racial history. We've got to own the type of inequalities that we're having, because we want to paint, conservatives want to paint that the liberals are the problems, the liberals want to paint the conservatives as the problems. But the truth is that in American history, we as a nation haven't been radical enough. That this has been a uniquely American problem.
This is a systemic problem that
Very systemic problem.
liberals and conservatives.
Right, absolutely. That we're all caught up in it. But what we know is that if we can defeat gravity, if we can make spaceships, we should be able to feed children. We should be able to educate children. That these goals are not utopian. They're very basic to human dignity and what we can do as a nation. And one of the things, and maybe this will be my last comment, is that what I start off the book saying is that it's actually in the times of crisis that we can begin the type of paradigm shifts that we need. And throughout scientific history, scientific revolutions happened in times of crisis when new paradigms and ways of thought were able to emerge that really changed the game. It isn't this incremental, steady progress. Galileo, Newton, Einstein, they didn't bring steady progress, they brought paradigm shifts. And Thomas Kuhn writes the book that brings the term paradigm shift into America's vernacular. And it's a time now where I think that we must have a paradigm shift. And the type of paradigm shift that we need are from the voices like a Martin Luther King Jr., from the Frederick Douglasses, Ida B. Wells, and from the contemporary people that are working on these issues like an Abram X. Kendi, Michelle Alexander, Ta-Nehisi Coates. That the truth is that we have had answers to this. We just have always refused to ignore the people that had the answers and ended up harmonizing realistic policy, what we thought were realistic politics, with radical racial and economic inequalities. And that harmony has to come to an end.
To wrap it up, my last question to you is, you say white America needs to learn a new way of being human. What do you mean by that?
I think when I say that we need to learn a new way of being human, in a very similar passage, you know, one of the things that I compare is the difference between the hippies and the civil rights advocates. In the 60s, the counterculture ended up expressing itself in Woodstock. And it was this time of freedom and in love and this, that, or the other. And yet one of the only African Americans invited to that party is Jimi Hendrix. That the truth of the matter is that when you look at the hippies, it was every bit as segregated and every bit as racist very often as what they said that they were rejecting.
Right.
And I applaud them for fighting against Vietnam, which they did. But they didn't enter into the type of solidarity that saw the problems that were going on in the inner cities as their problems. The children of African American.
I don't see that as a new way of being human, though.
Well, for I think white people to stand in solidarity, in actual solidarity, I think that would be a very new way in America. And where we can embrace the type of self-sacrifices to do the work that we need to. We've wanted to say that we could get there by enlightened self-interest, and I just don't think that history teaches us that.
Okay. So we got a wrap. My guest has been Joel Edward Goza. He's a minister, an activist, and the author of America's Unholy Ghost, The Racist Roots of Our Faith and Politics. Thanks, Joel, so much for being on the show.
I'm so honored for the time. So honored. Thank you, Rob. I appreciate it.